Thank you so much to everyone who is here this evening in person, and for those of you who are joining us via Zoom or YouTube. My name is Amy Kane. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Equity Officer for the City of Boulder. Tonight you are joining us as we do our community panel for the Independent Police Monitor recruitment process. We are doing a Spanish interpretation for this panel this evening. So the ask is that everyone speaks a little more slowly. Panelists, or candidates, when you are answering those questions, please keep that in mind. We do have online, if you're joining us online, you should have seen that there is a feedback request document at the end that you can click on to complete a survey to provide your feedback. For those of us joining us in person, you also have some QR codes on the seats. We have been collecting some questions in advance, so we'll be starting with some of those questions. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can also add additional questions that way. For the audience who has joined us this evening, you should have picked up some note cards. If you need another note card, feel free to raise your hand. Also, if you need a pen, we can provide that. And Amy will be collecting those questions as we move forward. So when you have a question, Heather, our recruiter, will be sorting through to make sure we're not asking the same questions over and over. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start first with our candidates. If each of you could provide just an intro and then why you're interested in this position. And if you could stick to about 2 to 3 minutes, we've been really fortunate to have many questions already submitted, and I know our wonderful audience is going to have some questions as well. So with that, I'd ask Mac, would you start off with the introductions, and then we can go towards Gina and then Kathy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Sounds good. I'm Mac Muir, most recently a supervising investigator with the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Want to jump back to the beginning. Grew up in Oakland, California, born and raised, and my career really started tutoring youth in Oakland. I worked at an organization throughout high school that was focused on literacy among black youth. Went to Oberlin College, where I studied policing, politics, and Africana studies. And then I worked for Governor Hickenlooper here in Denver for about 2.5 years in various roles. I worked on judicial appointments with him. I worked archiving executive orders, and I also traveled around the state with Governor Hickenlooper, briefing him on policy issues as we went. Spent the last 7 years at the Civilian Complaint Review Board. That's the largest oversight agency in the country. As I worked my way up that organization, really starting out as a level 1 investigator and ending up as a supervisor, I worked on high-profile cases. That's shootings, chokeholds, serious force cases, complicated multiple officer, multiple civilian cases, and supervised a team of 6 or 7 investigators at a given time toward the end there. Along with that, I trained investigators, mentored investigators, wrote grants, developed a monthly case workshop for investigators to share investigative tactics, and then have continued to work. I worked a little bit on Hickenlooper's 2020 campaign as an advisor on policing, and have been very involved in the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, where I maintain membership and attend whatever conference I can, and I'm on several subcommittees, working groups for NACOL. So I'm really excited to be here. I think Boulder has an excellent opportunity to continue to create robust oversight. That's because of the community and the community's values here, and also because you're just here at a time where there's expertise in civilian oversight as you're building it up, as opposed to a lot of other cities that had to build it with just less knowledge, fewer resources. And I've seen from the community extraordinary dedication to that, and I'm excited going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac. I just ask before, Gina, you chime in, make sure you all talk a little slower, just to keep in mind for our interpreters. It's hard.
All right, thank you.
I get in trouble for it all the time. Gina?
Okay. Can everyone hear me? All
Yes.
right, perfect. So my name is Gina Torres. I am from Albany, New York, No, it is not the city. I'm from Albany, New York, born and raised there. My current position is a police monitor with the Albany Community Police Review Board. Prior to that,
We good?
Okay. Oh, continue. Okay. That's okay. Prior to that, I was a police officer for Albany Police Department for the better half of my career, and I was a police officer in general for about 5 years. I studied at the State University at Albany and have a bachelor's degree in emergency preparedness, homeland, and cybersecurity. Okay, sorry. I don't want to have anybody miss anything. I studied at the State University with a bachelor's degree in Homeland and Cybersecurity. During my time as a police officer, I was the director of the Community Engagement Unit. I started a lot of programs, such as the Ride Along program, Coffee with a Cop, different initiatives to enhance mental health awareness and mental health awareness training. Such as programs with the local universities where I started internships with students in psychology, criminal justice backgrounds to actually work with the police departments when they were, did have an arrest of something with a mental health call. So I've done a lot of initiatives in that regard as well. My my come about of Boulder was kind of a very organic happening. I was doing a NACOL conference and I saw the opportunity online and I decided to look into it. I looked at Boulder and I said, this is a gorgeous place. I started doing some research into the community and it is a beautiful community. So I'm excited to share my expertise and my experiences and to also gain an outside perspective as well. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Kathy?
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kathy Rodriguez, and I currently work for Colorado Post, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training. It's housed at the Colorado Attorney General's office. I have been there for about 4.5 years as the compliance manager. I supervise almost half of the team at Post, and our purview currently has to do with overseeing all peace officer academies. There's about 35 of them in Colorado, if you didn't already know. And I also oversee certification of police officers. With that comes removal of certification. Due to a variety of different reasons. So we are the regulatory body for peace officers in Colorado. Prior to that, I earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from Metropolitan State University. I am a Colorado native. I grew up in Arvada, so I have spent the majority of my time in the Denver metro area. I currently live in Denver and work downtown Denver. After graduating college, I worked with committed youth in a rehabilitation facility for 2 years. I then became a probation officer. I did that job in Adams County for 10 years. Half of that time I did investigations and made sentencing recommendations to judges. I left there and worked for the Division of Criminal Justice at the Colorado Department of Public Safety, and I staffed the Sex Offender Management Board. I trained law enforcement along with probation, treatment providers, polygraph examiners, and did everything from run meetings like we're in right now with communities to policy work, and also worked with cities that were looking at instituting residence restrictions on sex offenders and talked them out of doing it because it was in the best interest of public safety. I did some work with the ACLU on cases like that. I then went and worked with Department of Regulatory Agencies as a director. I oversaw all the mental health boards. about 47,000 licensees and a full staff. And then I worked for Adams County again, overseeing their victim program. I had 15 victim advocates, court advocates, and did a lot of different projects there before I went to Post. So very, very excited and happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. So we will start with our first question, our first official question that was posted online. How do you build and maintain working relationships with the police department as well as the community? And we'll go ahead and start, Gina, with you this time.
Sure. So one of the things that I have been pretty honored to have the opportunity to do is do that in my current position. As you know, I used to work as a police officer for the position where I currently oversee, and maintaining that has been definitely a task. I think more than anything, it's important to have objectivity when looking at anything and keeping the relationships, open with open lines of communication, having the ability to communicate with both parties, the community and the police department, in a way where you can talk about the hard topics, where you can talk about the concerns and the policy recommendations. I'm sorry.
You're good.
I don't know what time. I'm finished.
You're good. Okay, thank you. All right, Kathy, would you like to take that next?
Sure. So I would say, along with Gina, I've had the opportunity to also build working relationships with police officers and police departments in my current position. While I am in a regulatory position and handling compliance, my motto has been that in order to manage compliance, it's really important to work with law enforcement on the front end by having really clear expectations and building strong relationships. That prevents a lot of problems so that we don't wind up having issues. And that's actually gone a long way. I joke that compliance isn't a dirty word because when we provide a lot of technical assistance in advance and help, then we wind up not having an adversarial relationship. Also doing outreach efforts, that's one of the favorite parts of my job. I love going out and educating and providing curriculum and providing information to people who may not understand or have certain information, and finding ways to do that that's creative is something I really, really enjoy. I think how you do that can be a combination of factors. Getting to know leadership in the police department. I do have a relationship with the current chief, but it is it's based on working in committees through my work, and that's been quite minor work. So we only know each other briefly. So I would need to really build more of a relationship. But I think it's also very important to understand the boundaries and the independence of the roles. As far as community work, I think those relationships are so important right now in doing a lot of outreach and partnering with important organizations, non-governmental entities, nonprofits, finding out who those partners are in the community and really collaborating and partnering with them to see how you can work together. And I think that's how I would do it.
Thank you. Mac?
I think to build trust, you need expertise first and foremost. And you can do that particularly in this kind of role with both officers and the community and the department and the community by showing that you really know what you're talking about. And that begins with knowing how this ordinance works and the history of the ordinance over the last few years. That is followed by knowing investigations well. I think that the community needs to know that I would hold myself to the highest investigative standard when looking at someone else's work. And I think an officer would want to know the same when they know somebody's reviewing a case that can impact their career. And so just expertise at its core and building expertise, not only for the monitor, but for the police panel itself. The police oversight panel is going to need trainings on a regular basis that keep them up to date on the highest standards that we as a city can hold. And I think that it's going to be the monitor's job to be going out across the country, getting those high standards, and then teaching them in a meaningful way that's accessible not only from a professional perspective, but one that can be brought back to the community and say, here's what I learned. Here's what I learned about police officer standards. Here's what I learned about investigations. And here's where Boulder's standards are hopefully higher than they are on a national level. Along with trust, you need clarity. And that means really explaining how this process works, how the ordinance impacts the lives of everyday people. So that'll mean saying, here's where you stand as a civilian relative to the police department. Here's what the independent monitor's office is intended to do, and explaining that in clear language on a really regular basis. It's the challenge of bureaucracy for us to get lost in acronyms. I think that happens really easily. And my hope would be that the independent monitor could ensure that every time there was a public meeting, there was even just a re-explanation of why we're here. And doing that constantly is going to reinforce community trust that there's somebody who's always acknowledging there's going to be somebody else in the room who doesn't know what's going on. And we need to bring them in. And if we do that every single week, every single meeting, we can have community trust through that clarity and through that expertise.
Thank you. So our next question. Do you have any examples of initiatives that you've worked on to increase transparency and community involvement? And for this one, Kathy, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure. I would say the most, probably the best example would be the work that I've done on community notification and through the job that I had with the Sex Offender Management Board. I was required through my responsibilities in my position to assist law enforcement in conducting notification meetings, town hall meetings, similar to what we're doing right now, and to ensure that not only the meetings were conducted effectively, but that the community received the information that was helpful to them, and that also that they received information that was required by law. Those were done all over the state, and when I started doing them, the meetings were done in one sort of way, and I worked really hard to change those over the course of a couple of years, meaning that I asked for feedback from the community because they were the customer, right? I mean, yes, there was a statutory mandate that law enforcement had to do this, and it wasn't an easy task. We wanted to make sure that people weren't scared. These were meetings when sexually violent predators were moving into their neighborhoods. And so people were typically pretty emotional when these meetings happened, and so we were trying to ensure that they felt safe, they felt heard, and that they were able to provide feedback. One of the complaints that we would get is that certain people were left out or not invited to the meetings, and so I worked with the production company with a very small budget and created a professional video so that we could start utilizing it, and people didn't have to leave their homes if they didn't want to. They could watch the same type of meeting, get the same information, and then I would ask the department to provide information about how they could send inquiries. So if for some reason there was a question that did not get answered, they could still have contact information for somebody to contact at the police agency, the sheriff's office or police department, and still be heard and get the information that they needed. And it was incredibly successful.
Thank you. Mac?
So in terms of Transparency, if you've worked in police oversight for long enough, you know that there aren't a lot of initiatives across the country that I think hit the bar in the way they need to. So what I can say is that I've been a political advisor and I've worked on policing legislation with candidates before in terms of what they're going to propose, and that I try to advise that they advocate for the most transparent policing policies that allow for oversight to do its job. Beyond that, as an investigator, that's simply just not the role that's not your role. When it comes to community involvement, as an investigator and as a supervisor, I went out into the community and took complaints from people who had been victims of police violence. And that means meeting with their families, that means meeting with their children, and explaining the process. I mean, I've explained the process in front of mothers and fathers multiple times of children who've been victims of police violence, and explaining the process in a clear enough way that they have some confidence that if not something meaningful is going to be done, they'll know exactly what's going to be done going forward. And I think there's always meaning behind that so that they understand. You know, in New York, I would say, here's what I'm able to do, here are the limitations of it, and you should at least be aware of that as a citizen. And I think that there's a benefit every single time of saying, you know, if you want something else, you should be aware of what exactly exists, because that's the only way you can change it. And then in terms of community involvement, at the CCRB certainly, what you could do is you can encourage the participation of anyone who came and filed a complaint in changing the rules of the CCRB, at showing up at public meetings, and trying to understand it as best they could. Thank you.
Thank you. Gina?
Amy, do you mind repeating the question? I apologize.
Nope, my pleasure. Do you have any examples of initiatives you've worked on to increase transparency and community involvement?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I would say my biggest initiative in the transparency of just what we do as an oversight review board is really the education piece. It is kind of this kind of up and coming thing, this new initiative that has been really taken by force recently, and I think it's a very necessary thing that needs to be in every police department, just for the simple fact of, you know, the community knows that there are others who are objective and independent of the police agencies that are looking at their complaints. So, you know, this has also influenced just the people who normally wouldn't submit a complaint because it's going straight to the police department, and there is no independent body. So just really picking that piece apart of the education factor in what exactly the review board does, how it operates, that we are an independent body, that we have our own bylaws, we have our own rules and regulations that is apart from the police department and all other state and local agencies that we look at and that we, you know, go by in our interpretation. So as far as the transparency piece, I have taught initiatives in the community for what police officers are taught in the academy. Are they taught de-escalation? What type of de-escalation? What type of, you know, how they handle certain situations, traffic stops, et cetera. So at least if they are stopped or if they do have a situation where they run into with police, they're able to have some education and training as to, you know, maybe why and how to respond to that. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you. What is your personal vision of policing for the near future for Boulder and beyond? And Mac, we'll start with you on this one.
So that's a big question.
2 to 3 minutes. Slowly.
We'll fix it during that time. So the reality is, I know the NYPD better than most, and I don't know the Boulder Police Department like the back of my hand, and I don't think I can really say, to a certain extent, the future of the Boulder Police Department in a way that would be, I think, honest and meaningful, other than to say, I would hope that my vision reflects my values, generally speaking. My values include every police department taking the concerns of the community and the people it polices very seriously. I've seen that in the annual reports from the police department. I've also heard complaints about how that's handled. And I think that the monitor would need to weigh both effectively and give the department credit where credit is due, and continue to raise questions where they exist. I think the future of the Boulder Police Department and police departments nationwide really depends on, and you'll hear this from me again tonight, hiring more women. I think it's the core of the future of policing that police departments have far more women among their ranks. Average nationwide is 15%. Average in police leadership is 3%. The Boulder Police Department has a bunch of vacancies for police officers and a great opportunity to hire a lot of women and show the nation how we can do this effectively. The benefits are myriad. You find that female officers get fewer complaints. They are the subject of far fewer lawsuits, and they tend to have better relationships with the community. And they're often far more equipped to handle investigations into sex crimes, really. So that's the thing I'm going to harp on most, but I think there's a wide a range of issues that I'd need a little more expertise to be able to diagnose. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Gina?
I can definitely agree with you on that one, Mac. For me, I think a revamp of, again, I know I only have a couple of minutes, but a purge of our criminal justice system kind of, as a whole. I think that there are a different style of doing things now, and my simple answer would be for more compassion, more relatability and empathy, just in general in policing, and having those conversations and having, bringing back feelings into policing. It's not, it can't be an agency anymore where it's a fear-based agency. First of all, that's not how you get anywhere, and especially with these newer generations up and coming, they're not fearful at all. So, having it as a fear-based mentality, a paramilitaristic mentality, that has to go, because it does not work anymore. It doesn't make the differences that we need to see in our communities and the vision that we see for having community and police come together as one. So if we're gonna keep having the same fear-based system, then it's never going to work, in my opinion. I think that compassion needs to start at the academy level. I've said this many times when speaking about the way that I see policing just in general, and I think it needs to start at the academy level, and instead of having that breakdown where we're breaking these new police officers down, they need to be in the community, and they need to be doing things and building these relationships before they start as police officers, so that once they are a police officer, they're in inner cities. They are familiar with the troubled kids. They're familiar with the college hotspots. They're familiar with all of these areas and the people who have these complaints or have these instances or are arrested, so that they can build those connections. And instead of an arrest and jail and kind of the same cyclical process, it's more of that relationship building instead of just this cyclical process of that we've been going through for now centuries. So that's where I see. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Kathy?
Thank you. So my personal vision is probably a bit idealistic, but for now, I would like the Boulder Police to continue working on the plan that they have laid out for the reimagining police, which they talk about the holistic governance. I think that is one start. I think also the work that the city has started on with the racial equity plans and incorporating that into the police department is really, really important. Part of what Gina was talking about with the academies, I know that Boulder and CU Boulder are both looking at, the possibility of hosting an academy, and that's something that I'm quite familiar with. And Post itself is doing a long-term project at revamping all academy curriculum, which is a massive project, because we're very aware that, and the Attorney General is very aware that things need to be revamped. So I wholeheartedly agree with what Gina was referring to. I think that some of the things that need to be a part of the police department moving forward are things like sanctity of life. And that needs to be something in all police departments, really, when we're looking at use of force and de-escalation. And also, though, trust and legitimacy, when we're talking about procedural justice, those are things that are incredibly important, whether it's with oversight or the police department. That has to happen in order for policing to be effective in the community at this point.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to one of our in-studio audience questions. How would you, as police monitor, I'm gonna have to put my glasses on for this one, maintain neutrality and the appearance of neutrality while also, of necessity, engaging with the police and police department you would oversee? And Jean, if we could start with you on that one.
Sure. Amy, I'm sorry. Do you mind repeating the last portion of that question?
How would you, let me do the whole thing. Okay. How would you, as police monitor, maintain neutrality and the appearance of neutrality while also, out of necessity, engaging with the police and police department you would oversee?
Thank you. You know, that's a great question. Thank you for whoever asked that. I think that the way that I maintain neutrality now is probably the way that I'll continue maintaining neutrality, and that's, seeing things for what they are and also being on the side of humanity. At the end of the day, I am a human. We're all human, and we all just want to be heard with everything. So when there is a complaint that comes in, when there is something that I'm talking, if I am speaking with the panel or if I am speaking in the community, I am always Gina. You're not going to get anything different. You're not going to get a different side of me. And when I'm speaking to the police chief, I'm Gina. When I'm speaking in the community, I'm Gina. So as far as the neutrality and the consistency with that, that's always going to be me. I'm going to fumble my words. I'm going to not know what to say, but I am resourceful and I will get the answer for you. I'm not going to make something up. I'm not going to pretend I know the answer or pretend I know all the answers. But one of the things that I have been very successful at in my career is being resourceful and finding the people and the experts in those fields that I can get the answer from and, bring it back when we have this instance. So as far as neutrality goes, just being my authentic self is really the best that I can provide to the Boulder community.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
Kathy?
Thank you. So I am an incredibly genuine person, and I really, I think, present as I am regardless of what role I'm in or what position I'm in. But I think having experienced some of the positions that I have fulfilled in the past has helped me. Being a probation officer and an investigator through probation, my role there was to be extremely objective. It wasn't to have a side. It was to report and recommend. And since then, I've been in positions where I have also had to remain very objective. I've worked with boards for several years, and again, staffing boards, you're in a very unique position because you are not the board member. You're supporting the board. Yes, you may have an opinion, but if you are not a voting member of a board, it is very important to remain independent. And so after having fulfilled those roles for so many different years in different positions, I think that it's placed me in a really good light as far as practicing being objective, being transparent, and really ensuring that there isn't a perception of impropriety, or that I am ensuring that when I am doing my job, that really there's equity in treatment for all of the different parties. I think that obviously the relationships are incredibly important. Having good relationships with the panel and with the police department are very important. And like I said before, having worked in compliance for so long and in regulatory capacities, it doesn't have to be adversarial. You can still have good working relationships, but still maintain a high level of objectivity.
Thank you, Kathy. Mac?
So maybe this could be best described by me walking you through the investigative process at the CCRB. So if you're an investigator, first a stack of papers is slapped down on your desk. It's got the information about a new complainant. It's got details, maybe the identity of the officer, maybe not. It's got an incident location. You've got to go out there and you've got to find the people involved. You've got to contact them over the phone. You've got to go in person. You've got to interview the bystanders. You've got to interview the person at the deli who's got the video cameras. And you've got to ask them all about what did you see, what happened, and what's your take on all this. And then you go and you summarize all that, and then you find the officers. And once you find the officers, you bring them in and you sit down with them with their union attorney present. And you ask them what happened here. And they'll tell you what happened in their own words, just as everyone else did. And you need to really listen to every single person in that process. You hear what they said, and you take, to a certain extent, you take them at their word. You ask follow-up questions. Help me understand what you mean by that. Help me understand what you mean by that place. Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And as an investigator, you're a fact finder. But there's a transition when you do the analysis of a case, right? You have all this facts, you have everybody's testimony, maybe you have video footage, you summarize that to whatever professional standards you can. And then you stop and you have to write a report that summarizes what took place. And it's not everybody's take as to what happened, it's your take that synthesizes all that information together. And that's a role to treasure. It's a role that I've always treasured because you're taking everyone's lived experiences and trying to translate it into something that really applies as it relates to the law, and that's not really a lived experience, but you're sort of creating your own incident. What do I think happened here? What's my analysis? And I think at its core, to have independence, you need to be willing to think very critically and take time to think of what am I going to determine happened here? What's my analysis of it? Is it fair? Is it within the law? Is it appropriate? And then you take a step back and you say, I did my best. And so for me, I think I take that approach with whatever work I do. I know that I had the respect of officers, their union representatives, and the people whose cases I investigated, because the victims in the cases knew that I was busting my butt, and the officers knew that I was good at my job. And oftentimes that's the best you can ask for in one of these tough processes. So as I've said before, I think expertise shows your professionalism, and in that way it shows neutrality, because there's only one way to be an expert in this particular field. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. What does being culturally responsive mean to you in this role? And we'll start with Kathy on this one.
I think that it's extremely important to be inclusive and equitable, and to ensure that the person that fulfills this role is not only, when you say being culturally responsive, ensuring that all voices are heard and there's mechanisms for everyone to have a voice, but also in conducting outreach and in working with community to really make sure that you're looking at really the entire community, not just one portion of the community. There's a lot of different people who could be negatively impacted by interactions with law enforcement, and so and Boulder is made up of a variety of different people in the community. I think while I am a Colorado native, I am not a resident of Boulder, so I would really want to learn more about the community as far as the community groups and all of the different organizations and the different partners that are available, so that there's really diverse representation and opportunities for partnering. If there isn't that representation, then I don't think that this position will be effective, especially given that there has to be, I know that right now the process for ascertaining complaints is allows anonymous complaints and allows telephone complaints and so on, outside of just receiving them within the police department. But I think it's also really important that whoever is in this position is in the community, not just kind of, another person working at the city. So I think that being culturally responsive is also just meeting people where they're at.
Thank you, Kathy. Mac?
Thank you. I think to be culturally sensitive in this job is to know the history of harm in the community. Frankly, I'm not from here. I don't know the history of harm. I know that white people probably came here and killed a bunch of Native people, and then that's what we're working with as a starting point for the land we're on. But it's really important to me that I learn the history of Boulder and of the various communities that feel aggrieved by the police, and that the history of the city itself in order to make any progress in this role. I think to be sensitive in this role, you need to understand generational trauma. You need to understand that a complaint is more than a single incident. It's about somebody's life and their story about what their life is and how it's been disrupted. And I think this role is going to rely on expertise. I'm not an expert in racial equity. I have my values, and I think that we've got a wonderful university here that's going to be able to supply a lot of expertise in terms of how to make this the most equitable role possible. And I would lean on it, certainly.
Thank you, Gina.
Just to kind of piggyback off of what Max said, I think literally everything you just said is super important to take note of, just in general, especially when we're dealing with land sensitivities and just kind of cultural sensitivities in general. I think one of the hurdles that we are working towards right now is having a place and an opportunity where culture is part of that decision in law enforcement. And then, it's not just dealing with a specific culture, it's dealing with how the police treat that specific culture, how they treat the towns, how they treat the cities, how they treat the housing of that specific culture. So in being culturally sensitive and being culturally responsive, I think that there needs to be bigger discussions to be had, and kind of, again, like Max said, that there needs to be expertise in this field. There needs to be those stakeholders in the community that come out and they can actually attest to what they've gone through with police officers and specific departments, and Boulder specifically, and the university if they've had any interaction. And that needs to be a topic of conversation that really delves into, because that's not a surface level complaint. That's not a surface level that's more of a crisis level. You're dealing with backgrounds and generations, and even just in general generational backlash from police, generational, I choose you just because of what you look like or what you talk like or where you live. Those conversations with community stakeholders and the police need to happen. So that's kind of where I see the direction for being culturally responsive in this role.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How would you ferret out racial bias in policing? And Gina, we'll go ahead and keep going with you if you would. How would you ferret out racial bias in policing?
By ferret out, I'm sorry.
No, I would assume, and is this an online question or is this an audience question?
I'm assuming it kind of
It's a Zoom
means
question. I would assume that it means how would you
get rid
dig
of
it
or
out?
Okay, of racial bias.
Mm-hmm.
So I think racial bias is more than just a surface level problem as the culturally responsive issue. When you deal with racial bias, you deal with more than just, hey, I don't like you because you're this. It is most likely a part of how a person was raised or an experience that they've had that's made them be that way or think that way. So I think that the best way to go about that is to ask somebody why, why did they make this arrest or why did they do this action, to get their reaction. Again, I don't think it's a surface level issue when you deal with any sort of racial bias. I think it's something that can be trickled down to, okay, well, how were you raised kind of thing, or, what did your family tell you that, why do you see this kind of point of view? So as far as dealing with racial bias on the police side, I think it's really getting down to the why, and kind of the same thing on the community aspect. There are community members, here and definitely in my community as well, who have had a bad experience with the police or haven't had a bad experience with the police, but their families have. And that also is a form of, a bias, right? Because I don't like the police because they've, arrested my family for no apparent reason. And I think both of those are, again, a deeper level that we have to delve into, and that's way more than just my capabilities. That's going to take a community. It's going to take experts in different fields. It's going to take, stakeholders from every angle, and also cooperation from the police departments to even be open on that level. And again, we can't get anywhere with moving towards the right way to do things if we're not honest and open about these conversations, because it may not be that you're like this because you want to be like this. It's what you were taught, or it's how you think the world may be. So having these deeper conversations and open forums where people can speak and be open in conversation, but also have empathetic conversations and compassion about it. I think that's the way that you move forward.
Thank you. Kathy?
Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple thoughts. I have had this debate for a while with friends and family and coworkers, and so first of all, policing nationwide is facing serious challenges with recruitment and retention. It's not just policing. I mean, it's like most employers are having issues recruiting and retaining employees, but policing is having a serious issue getting people to fill the positions. And there's a lot of reason for that, and I won't get too diverted into that situation. However, I think that part of this can be looked at hiring. That's not going to fix the problem. I don't think there's any one way to fix the problem necessarily, but I do think that if you are looking at people's biases, even through some assessments, we ask officers to go through quite a rigorous process for hiring. including psychological assessment, physicals. They're usually going through extensive backgrounds, but I don't know that they ever look at any kind of biases before they're hired. And I think that that would be really interesting to do before they are determined to be suitable candidates for hiring. So I think that's one issue. The other thing is that I think that they're, like Gina was saying, is, having open conversations and talking about it. I know that the state, the legislature mandated anti-bias training that is required by police. I don't think there's a whole lot of research that supports the effectiveness of that. However, it is a training that's required. There are maybe, awareness of implicit bias. I don't think that that's harmful, but it is one other thing that could probably help when we're talking about law enforcement, and specifically the role that they have and the populations that they are working with. As far as completely ferreting out, people that have issues and that are possibly acting out, I don't know if that's completely possible, but I do have other thoughts about data collection too, in looking at arrests and stop and search and things like that based on demographics. When we're looking at our police force, I think that some of that data might be helpful as well. And there are some early intervention systems. I don't know if Boulder uses that. I don't know if they have one, but if they do, it would be interesting to see what kind of data they have from that as well.
Thank you. Mac?
So there's pretty good precedent for, in the attempt to ferret out racial bias in policing, have studies that will go through and look at the demographics of, say, people who are stopped in car stops. And you can control for race by the amount of lighting, for example, and determine that there was racial bias in officers as general policies, right? In Nashville, they found that way more black folks were getting stopped. I mean, I'm sure that's not the only city. In Oakland, they found, by using body cam footage, they analyzed the language that the officers were using and found that officers were way more likely to just use harsher language toward black drivers, which is really useful. But then you question, like, to what end? And I think that that's the challenge, is there's one thing to measure the racial bias. I also think that for some of the issues that we face when it comes to to racism or racial bias in policing are reflective of grander social problems. And I think it's important to acknowledge that while it's such a major issue in policing, that the police are not the ones responsible for racism. This is a systemic issue that we all need to collectively be addressing at every moment, and that the police need to be brought into that process at every moment because they're the face of the government. But I think the best you can do right now is you can study disparities in policing. You can study disparities in stop and frisk. You can study disparities in arrest. But that also faces its own problems. In New York, there have been moments in which officers have adapted by, say, arresting more people who are white, and then your numbers change. And I think that there's a limitation to that, to the studying over time, because it changes the incentives of the officers and it may or may not help anything. What you can do is have a really inclusive environment that acknowledges that racism is present around us, within us, and that we can all be doing better at every waking moment, and that our policies should reflect that.
Okay. According to the position description, the police monitor must respect a variety of views. Based on your experience, please give hypothetical examples of different perspectives held by parties involved in a single complaint investigation. Mac, we're going to start with you on this one. I'm happy to repeat.
Can you repeat that?
Certainly. According to the position description, the police monitor must respect a variety of views. Based on your experience, please give a hypothetical example of different perspectives held by parties involved in a single complaint investigation.
Well, that I think applies to every case that I investigated and supervised. I mean, I've investigated a case in every NYPD precinct. There's 77, and supervised thousands at this point. So, in terms of varying perspectives, I mean, at its core, right, like it's no secret the NYPD's police union endorsed Donald Trump, and most of our complainants were from highly democratic, well, they're black and brown folks from highly democratic areas. So usually a case began with me interviewing a person who was feeling oppressed by their current system of government, expressing that in clear language, me having to really focus on the facts of the incident as opposed to that political view. And it's very, very important to compartmentalize the two. And then sit down with an officer who thought Bill de Blasio was a total jerk and he was screwing everybody by making cops' lives terrible, and then try to get the facts out of the incident and compartmentalize those and listen to both stories, because that's the job. So I think to whatever example I might give probably would be too personal, but I would say that that's part and parcel of being a professional investigator. You listen to people's perspectives, you get the facts, you explain the law. We're all here because this is the role of government at its current stage, and you respect what people have to say.
Thank you. Gina?
I'm going to ask you to repeat the question, please.
According to the position description, the police monitor must respect a variety of views. Based on your experience, please give a hypothetical example of different perspectives held by parties involved in a single complaint investigation.
I guess I'll first touch on kind of the opposing of views. I think we've gotten to a place just in our country in general where if you have a certain view, I can't talk to you or can't be your friend or can't, work with you for whatever reason. And, my opinion on that is I think we all have differing views about everything, right? That's what makes us unique. So bringing those views, together is another obstacle, and another way I think this position could be really instrumental in change, because respecting opposing viewpoints is absolutely part of this, and it's how this department is going to grow. Again, I'll say it again, I don't have all the answers, and that's okay, because some of you may have the answers, and that's how we work towards getting our community to a place where we all thrive. And I think that's part of the beauty in all of us having our different experiences and our different ways of life and families and values, because there's a space where we can bring that together as long as we're all open and able to share this. But that's one of the things that I hold very high in any work that I do. I always welcome differing opinions because it makes me better. Even if I don't necessarily agree with it, I've been in plenty of situations where I haven't agreed with whoever I was speaking with, but they give me their interpretation and I learn. And for a situation that I may have that comes up that I can use that information for, that's more valuable than having a disagreement and winning the argument. So I guess I would say an experience in an actual case or a hypothetical situation where I've had kind of this experience. As Max said, it's probably every case. There are many stakeholders all the time in this work, and that's okay because, again, you have the views of the police department, you have the views of the independent monitor, you have the views of the community, and I think if you can bring those all together and have an open conversation where you can speak about all of these things, then that's what's going to make this grow, and that's what's going to make us all be able to collectively make this in every city somewhere, where we all thrive and we can live together to actually have bridge that gap that everybody talks about for community and police department. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
So I'm thinking about how we handle our revocations. It's a little bit different from what Mac and Gina have talked about, but similar. So, you know, we either receive a notification of an issue, or I'm notified by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation that an officer has been arrested. So in either situation, we get a notification that there's an issue. And at that point, we need to determine if we're going to take action. And similarly, we have a lot of parties involved typically, because we have due process built into our system. And so we have hearings, official hearings. I'm a part of those hearings. And I have an investigator on my team. And that person, you know, conducts the investigations when necessary, and I oversee those. We have attorneys that are often utilized for the certificate holder, so they represent, you know, the certificate holder. And then we have our own attorney that's housed through the AG's office, and that person would be kind of like the city attorney right now to the panel. Then we have our board, and the post board is big. It's 24 people. So, and we have a whole process we go through. You know, if we determine, and typically it's our director who determines if really all statutory requirements are met and we're going to proceed with a revocation, and it is going to go before our board. At that point, the person has the right to request an appeal, and so we may go through a whole appeal process. And we have perspectives that range from, you know, the employer may get involved, they even with a conviction, or they may have disputes about, well, the officer's attorney didn't realize this was a decertifying crime, because there's a whole lot of crimes that you can commit and not lose your certification. So perspectives from the officer that may, you know, they may think that, you know, they just pled guilty, they didn't really do it. Or the attorneys, you know, they're there to represent their client, so they're going to do what they're going to do. But we still always listen to everybody, and especially to the officer, and hear them out and consider all sides. And our director's really great at that, actually, seeing the big picture. So that is one thing, is ensuring we have a very thorough due process. And I think, though, just ensuring that we're hearing everybody's perspective is the most important, and giving people the option and the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you. Okay, I've got tiny reading on this one. What does racial justice mean to you in the context of Boulder? And Gina, we'll start with you.
So I think racial justice means that, you know, everyone is treated like a human at the end of the day, and like anybody would treat their families, their parents, you know, anybody that they love. I think this side of justice, especially in the police department, is more on the side of equal treatment for that as well. So, you know, not being arrested just because you looked or act or lived a certain place or way, you know, having it be, you know, just equality, honestly. At the end of the day, we all want to go home to our families. At the end of the day, we all want to be treated like a person. We all want to be heard. We all want to have our, you know, our voices heard. We want to be treated equal. You know, I think one of the most damaging things that I've seen has been for me to be treated a different way, and for someone who doesn't look like me and looks different to be treated another way. I think that's the most dehumanizing thing that you can really, one of the most dehumanizing things that you can really do or kind of experience is be treated a different way because you look a certain way. You know, we can't control how we look or what nationality or race we are. So that shouldn't be something that we should be treated differently for or picked on for, you know, but it still happens, unfortunately. So I think getting to a place where you're treated differently because you're a bad person, as opposed to looking or acting differently, is kind of the racial and part of that social justice piece, at least the beginning aspect for me, for what I see.
Thank you, Gina. Kathy?
I think it's a complicated answer, but I would say that I agree with a lot of what Gina is saying, but I also think that some of the tangibles to that are things like inclusion in policies and you know, language access and seeing representation in our leadership. And if we're talking about, I know the question was in Boulder, but also if we're talking about in policing, you know, seeing diverse representation in policing. Also, just, I know that Boulder has, you know, recently really prioritized the racial equity plan, and even today in our tour, we talked a little bit about how that's playing out in some of the way that policies are being implemented and how assessments are being done and how it's different now than it used to be, which is really encouraging because it is a lot more progressive than things that I have been involved in government in the past. So to me, it's quite encouraging. I agree that there's always work to be done and there's always improvements to be made. And that's something that I care about a lot. So I think that also racial justice has to do with hearing and having opportunities for voices and always improving and having the opportunities for inclusion.
Thank you. Mac?
And the question was, what does racial justice look like in Boulder?
What does it mean to you in the context of Boulder?
What does it mean to me in the context of Boulder? Well, it's tough. Let's admit this is a white city predominantly, and I think that when you face issues of racial equity, you need to acknowledge what that is up front, and then really acknowledge that the minority is in more of a minority than it might be in other major cities. With that said, I think that at least two prongs. You've got equity, which, right, you can have the studies, and then you try to ensure that equity is factored into all future decision making. I think racial justice is also restorative. It's acknowledging the past and figuring out how you can not necessarily make up for it, but account for it whenever possible. Talk about the history and talk about what a future looks like that is racially just. And I think that needs to take into account the voices of the community that are in the minority, the people who want racial justice need to be the ones who are speaking out and whose voices are heard most, because that's the only way things are going to change.
Thank you. The Police Oversight Panel Ordinance provides that the police chief has final authority over case adjudication and disciplinary action. That ordinance also established an oversight panel. Have you taken a look at the current ordinance and considered ways that it could be fixed or resolved to assist transparency in the report out to the community? And we'll start with Kathy on this one.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I can. The Police Oversight Panel ordinance provides that the police chief has final authority over case adjudication and disciplinary action. That ordinance also established an oversight panel. Have you taken a look at the current ordinance and considered ways that it could be fixed or resolved to assist transparency in the report out to the community?
Okay. I am thinking of two different issues here. So the first issue that I personally have seen is that the way that the ordinance is written, and yes, I have read it a couple of times. I've also read the bylaws, is that there doesn't seem to be an appeal process in this charter. So it looks like there's the possibility of the independent monitor to have one opinion, the panel to have one opinion, and then the chief to have total decision-making authority. All of the boards that I have ever worked with have due process and have an appeal process, which this one does not. I find that quite interesting. I do understand that the chief of police in many oversight, panels or processes is the final authority, but I've seen others that the chief is not the final authority. So to me, I think it would be something to consider to change the charter and to look at an appeal process, whether that appellant is the city manager or the city council or another body, I'm not sure, but it is something that I think should be considered, especially in really serious misconduct cases, maybe not for the minor offenses. The transparency issue that I believe is the actual question, I think. It's my understanding that there is some work being done on the charter, and I think my understanding is that the discussions about discipline and the cases can only occur during meetings. And I think that's where the issue of transparency is coming up. So yes, I think that if there's an appetite to go in and change the charter and allow for a different process without violating any COMA, which is Colorado Open Meetings Act, or just minor modifications to the charter so that there can be more transparency about the recommendations or even about summaries on the cases, that would be important because you're still summarizing cases in the quarterly reports and in the annual reports. So I think that some modifications need to be done to the charter. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Mac.
I agree with you on the appeals process that exists in a lot of cities, and to what extent it should exist here is not clear, but I think that it's something that should certainly be looked into. Regarding transparency, I mean, in most cities, there is the ability for members of a version of the police oversight panel to discuss those cases to some extent. It varies, and I think that if this is going to be a transparent panel, then it should have to be able to discuss these to some extent. The important part is prioritizing the safety, though, safety of the civilian involved, ensuring that their information isn't disclosed just because we feel like talking about this bad thing that happened to them. I've seen, and that creates a huge chilling effect on complaints. If you think that in a public meeting somebody's going to discuss your life and the sad thing that happened to you, and I think for the officer's due process as well, you don't want to discuss a case that would in any way identify them because the process isn't complete, and you can't point fingers until there's been a full adjudication of justice. Beyond that, I think that whichever candidate is selected, we're going to learn a lot more about what this ordinance looks like in practice. You can stare at language for a long time, and you can even have reference points. for what it looks like in other cities, but Boulder's going to be handling this differently than other cities. I think that's been clear to all of us, having been here, is that you guys handle things differently. And I'll be excited to see what exactly that looks like, how everything's going forward.
Okay, thank you. Gina?
I agree, and I agree with both Kathy and Mac on this one. I think every other court system or violation system, there is an appeal process. So I think that is an important piece of having the ability to appeal, is something that I think is necessary to have this, especially if the chief, who is looked at as probably in support of police, is the one that ultimately is making the ultimate decision on the complaint. And I think further than that appeal process, there needs to be maybe some sort of a formal process beyond there, with other stakeholders who can review this process, the appeal itself, and come up with a consensus that way. So it's not just based solely on one person's opinion or discretion. Sorry, remove the word opinion. I did not mean to say that. We'll go with discretion, but just to not have it fall on just one individual person, because again, kind of as we have seen and discussed, that you can't have all views with just one perspective. There needs to be multiple, and if that means bringing in the officer and the complainant in different ways to discuss, different processes moving forward, then, maybe that's the case. If it's through an appeal process, with maybe a mini kind of judicial court setup, where there is community stakeholders, there are other stakeholders that, kind of want to grow this department, including the panel as well, then maybe that's the process that we need to go. But kind of how Mac discussed, it's very hard to kind of put a perspective in something that we're only reading and not able to fully live it yet. So thank you.
So it's 7:21. So we have time for one more question, and I've also been asked by the interpreters that you also slow down rate of speech. That's okay. It wasn't just you. That was a blanket statement. So one, guilty. What is your personal and professional relation to achieving inclusivity through language and actions? Gina, we're going to start with you.
I would say that my perspective on inclusivity just in general is something that's been super important to me. I've dealt with a lot of different populations, a lot of different, people who identify different ways, and it's been a little bit of a learning curve for me, and it's something that I'm so heavily delve into now, because I never want to disrespect anybody or make anybody feel any sort of way. So I have these open conversations and make it very clear that I want people to be open and honest with me, even just as far as, how they identify, what kind of culturally is disrespectful, because that's another factor as well. Maybe a handshake in another culture can mean a sign of disrespect, just kind of getting over those boundaries that, maybe I haven't been exposed to yet. And then I'm so willing to learn and be open to, these conversations, and, just having respect all around is just kind of what I always want to make sure I step into any room and people feel comfortable talking to me. They feel like it's a respectful conversation, and, one where they can trust and communicate in the way that they're comfortable as well.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, so when we're talking about language, one of the things, and I think I was talking about it earlier this evening, was when I worked for the DA's office, I had a project where I helped, it wasn't me specifically, my team, I had my team translate our documents, and it wasn't just for our county, it was for the entire state, even though I worked for the county, because our victims were not getting notifications. They were receiving English letters, and our population was vastly Latinx, and so they were primarily Spanish speaking, and this made quite a difference. And I wondered, when I was looking at everything that is in the current infrastructure for this position, and I know it's new, so no criticism whatsoever. If there are forms in Spanish, and if there are like the complaints and on the website and those kinds of things, if there are information materials available in other forms, so that is something that I think would be very important, at least to have some resources dedicated to that, again, in the name of inclusivity. And then I think also just in being very aware and cognizant and open about communication and relationships with everybody that I come into contact with, especially in the community, and working towards having really good participation and buy-in and investment from community members who may have been impacted by police, or who are just even interested in having a say in what's going on in policing in their community.
Thank you. Mac?
Yeah, so inclusivity through language and action is about spending time. It's about spending time with people, because I'm not going to tell somebody else how I'm going to be inclusive toward them. They're going to tell me how I'm going to be inclusive toward them. And it takes listening, it takes having a growth mindset at all times, and being willing to have some egg on your face from time to time and say, I'm sorry, and move on, and improve and be committed to improving. I'm sure there are ways that that the city is not being inclusive. I'm sure there's ways I'm not being inclusive in a given moment, and we're all still learning at any given time. So regarding policy itself, I worked briefly with the city of Oakland, the Oakland Police Commission, drafting some of their policies in their patrol guide, and related, adjacent to a scandal that took place. And I've worked with politicians in the presidential level and Senate elections, congressional elections, and on local levels. And you have to be really thoughtful about how you speak and the actions you take. And you have to be genuine if you're going to be any good at it. So I would say stick to growth mindset and listen to the people around you.
Thank you. So that concludes our interview panel for this evening. So I just want to thank the candidates so much. That was an hour and a half of a lot of questions, and thank you guys so much for participating, and for our studio audience, and then also for those who are joining us online via Zoom. We do, again, have the feedback mechanism on our website, so please do provide your feedback. We do have a bunch of interviews tomorrow scheduled for our candidates, so we are going to graciously let them go for the evening, get some rest, and just want to thank everybody who came out this evening. Really appreciate you, and for those of you who were able to join us via YouTube and Zoom, just much gratitude to you. This is an incredibly important position for our community and our organization, and I appreciate everybody making the time for this work. So thank you so much, and with that, have a very safe drive home tonight.